בקשתנו המיוחדת לחלוק עמכם את האירועים ההיסטוריים שמתרחשים בימים אלה ואמורים להסתיים בקרוב. מגורק הוא אדם מכונן, מוכשר מאוד, זריז מחשבה, נכנס לתפקידו במהירות והוא מיטיב לתאם ולהוביל, כולל התעסקות עם פרטי פרטים, את המאבק ההיסטורי שילמד בספרי היסטוריה ויגיע כנראה לסיומו בקרוב. אני מדבר על החליפות, אני לא מדבר על הטרור. יש פה מין פרדוקס, ככל שהחליפות תתכווץ, אז הטרור יכול להתרחב, אין בזה קשר לוגי ישיר. וכמובן גם צומחת לשם כרגע ברית בין איראן, חיזבאללה ותמיכת בשאר אסד ובגיבוי רוסי, את כל הדברים האלה עמדנו. אני מתכוון להזמין את מגורק, המתאם המיוחד למלחמה ולמאבק בדאעש, שיישא דברים ויחלוק עמנו כיצד ארצות הברית מובילה את המאבק וכיצד ארצות הברית רואה את העתיד הצפוי לנו בעתיד הקרוב, בטווח הקרוב, על סמך הניצחונות ההיסטוריים שצפויים. בבקשה, מיסטר מגורק.
Thank you very much, Amos, distinguished colleagues, friends. I'm honored to be with you on this beautiful morning here in Herzliya, and my remarks will focus on our campaign to destroy ISIS, not just militarily in Raqqa and Mosul, but also in cyberspace and ideologically. My colleague, Tina Kadenow, later today will address this conference focusing on the historic security partnership between Israel and the United States, a partnership that is unbreakable. In that regard, let me just recognize you, Amos. You've always made yourself available to discuss the complexities of this most complex region with myself and many of our colleagues, including a very interesting conversation this morning. And we've benefited greatly from your hard-earned wisdom and decades of experience. So I just want to say thank you for your lifelong commitment to serving your great country, protecting your people, and now for bringing such a remarkable group together at this conference. It's really, I think this is your maiden voyage in organizing this conference, and we're off to a terrific start. So, my remarks this morning will first define the ISIS challenge, review where we have been from 2014 through the end of this year. I'll then address some changes to our campaign initiated by President Trump, where the campaign stands at this very hour, as well as where we see it going over the coming months. So what is ISIS? It is the largest, most sophisticated, and most global terrorist organization the world has ever seen. Only 2 years ago, it controlled what was effectively a quasi-state, its so-called caliphate with territory the size of Lebanon spanning across Iraq and Syria. It controlled millions of people, entire cities, dual capitals in Raqqa and Mosul, generating revenue, oil and gas, through oil and gas, taxes, antiquities trade, hostage taking of more than $1 billion per year. It enslaved thousands of young girls, committed acts of genocide against minority groups, Yazidis and Christians, and sought to destroy our common human heritage, from Palmyra in Syria to the Nineveh Plains in northern Iraq. It also established franchises, 7 in all from Sinai just to our west, to Afghanistan, Libya, and Nigeria, all with central direction and planning from its capital in Raqqa. And it sought to spread terrorism to all of our homelands, directing attacks from Raqqa in Paris, Istanbul, and Brussels, and inspiring them from London to Berlin to Garland, Texas. Its manpower at its height in 2015, it's hard to pinpoint specifically, but at its height in 2015, was in the upper tens of thousands of hardcore fighters, at least. The figures we can pinpoint are staggering. More than 40,000 foreign fighters, foreign jihadis, flooded into Syria between 2013 and 2016 from over 100 countries all around the world. The world had really never seen anything like it, this supercharged global jihad. General Gilad, many of us in this room were extremely alarmed by this phenomenon way back in 2013. Many of us in Washington, some of my former colleagues here, were discussing it with extreme concern. Foremost attention among many, however, in those years, I think we have to be honest, there was a belief by some that this flood of jihadi fighters could somehow be tamed and contained after Bashar al-Assad was removed from power. I think that was a false assumption, and it carried some tragic consequences. This flood of extremist fighters and weapons into Syria, combined with the crimes of the Assad regime and its patrons, created an explosive environment for al-Qaeda from which ISIS sprung. ISIS rapidly spread. In 2013, rapidly spread across Syria, killing anyone who sought to confront it. It spread openly into Iraq in January 2014, capturing Fallujah and laying siege to Ramadi in Anbar province. Suicide attacks in Iraq, nearly all of whom at the time were committed by foreign fighters, people coming from around the world into Syria and Iraq to blow themselves up, rose from 5 to 10 a month in 2012 to sometimes 60 per month in 2014. Targeting markets, mosques, soccer games, local officials, mayors, town councils, and security personnel. In June 2014, Mosul, a city of nearly 2 million people, fell to ISIS, and its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, declared a caliphate from the mosque, the Grand Mosque of al-Nouri in Mosul's old city. And late yesterday, as Iraqi security forces closed in on that mosque, about 100 meters away, ISIS blew it up. A mosque which sat there since the 12th century, ISIS blew it up. And I think we have to just, the last month in Mosul, if I just ad-lib a bit, is really telling. Summer of 2014, Baghdadi announces from that mosque that he's the caliph creating a caliphate. The caliph proclaims his legitimacy by his ability to protect people in his so-called caliphate. All of this was a false lie, but that's what he said in the summer of 2014. In the last month, as Iraqi security forces have closed in on their last district in Mosul, ISIS has killed any civilian trying to leave. They used a hospital on some high ground just north of the old city as a killing tower, with snipers killing any civilian trying to leave. We've actually been accused, our military forces, of using white phosphorus, for example, in Mosul. And I defer to my military professionals, but they used white phosphorus not to target anybody, not to kill anybody, but as a shield to allow civilians to escape. And we were somehow declared of using ammunition which was harming civilians. In fact, we were helping civilians escape as ISIS sat in a tower, a hospital, which we did not want to target, and killed anyone that tried to leave. And last night they blew up the mosque in which Baghdadi declared his caliphate. I think it was a very significant moment here in the last 24 hours. But back in 2014, if you rewind the tape, that announcement of a caliphate accelerated recruitment from around the world. Thousands of young men, women, and even children traveled through Turkey and into Syria through established smuggling networks. About a month later in July, ISIS broke through the western Iraqi border town of Al-Qaim and approached Baghdad, down the Euphrates Valley, and also in the north down the Tigris Valley. Near Tikrit that summer in 2014, ISIS terrorists rounded up 1,700 young Iraqi military cadets and murdered them one by one. And they filmed the whole scene on YouTube. I was in Iraq at the time when this was all happening, and newspaper headlines declared Baghdad was about to fall. There were reports of 0 hour coming any moment in the capital. It was causing a panic among the population. We, in fact, reduced our embassy personnel, even dusted off some contingency evacuation plans given the uncertainty. And President Obama, early in the crisis, asked for my recommendation, among others, some of whom are in this room, Melissa Slotkin and others, about what we should do. And our only response is we had to fight back and fight back soon because we had no other choice. But we had to fight back smartly, not with U.S. forces in Iraqi and Syrian towns and villages, but by strengthening local forces, Syrians and Iraqis, to take the fight themselves, combined with devastating air power, and importantly with a political strategy that empowered people at the local level to secure their own communities with a government in Baghdad that was responsive to its people. We had to rally the world, particularly the Muslim world, to take on the fight themselves, combating ISIS's poison in the mosques and online in the media 24/7. We had to ensure that what came after ISIS was more stable, creating the conditions for people to return to their homes and rebuild their devastated communities. And we had to prepare a campaign that targeted ISIS financing, its foreign fighter networks, its global affiliates, and its propaganda. And in the summer of 2014, that seemed like a nearly impossible task. The Iraqi security forces had just completely, totally collapsed, and we had almost nobody to work with on the ground in Syria. But we got to work. We built a global coalition against ISIS, which is now the largest coalition of its kind in history, now with 71 members, including 67 nations plus NATO, Interpol, the EU, and the Arab League. Early on, we organized this grand coalition around 5 specific lines of effort, each focusing on a particular aspect of the ISIS problem and pooling global resources to confront it. First, we'd provide military support to our partners on the ground. Second, we'd work to stop the flow of foreign fighters by securing the border between Syria and Turkey and severing the international networks. Third, we'd halt ISIS's access to financial support. Fourth, we'd address humanitarian and stabilization in areas cleared of ISIS to allow the population to return. And fifth, we'd combat ISIS's poisonous ideology. The first airstrikes by our coalition were launched in September 2014, and there have been nearly 30,000 since. It's been the most precise air campaign in history, and combined with aggressive and innovative global initiatives along each of the lines I just mentioned. And while this war is far from over, the results to date are promising. On the ground, in Iraq and Syria, coalition-supported forces have cleared over 60,000 square kilometers of territory that had once been held by ISIS. And significantly, all of that territory, no territory liberated by a coalition-enabled operation has been retaken by ISIS. 60,000 square kilometers, they have not retaken any of it. These coalition-enabled operations have freed over 4 million people who had been living under ISIS. In Iraq alone, in addition, 1.9 million people, formerly displaced people, have now returned to their homes in areas liberated from ISIS. The flow of displacement from 2014 has completely reversed. People are no longer fleeing Iraq, they are actually returning to their homes, and its rate of return in a post-conflict environment is historically unprecedented, and due to the work we do not just militarily but also politically and through stabilization to create those conditions. Even in Mosul, where, as I mentioned, combat operations are ongoing as we speak at this hour, in the liberated eastern side of the city, 250,000 boys and girls, according to the UN's own figures, that's 250,000 boys and girls who only 6 months ago were living under ISIS, are back in school. And 190,000 Mosul citizens, Moslawis, have returned to their homes. On foreign fighters, we've largely halted the flow into Syria from Turkey, from hundreds a week to now a handful at most a month. The Syrian-Turkey border, much of which had been controlled by ISIS on the Syrian side only 2 years ago, is now controlled by coalition-backed forces on the Syria side, and largely sealed from the Turkish side. In addition, our coalition is building a global database of foreign fighters through information-sharing networks and Interpol to ensure that anyone who fought with ISIS in Syria and Iraq can be identified in either routine traffic stops, border entry points, or in the course of routine police work. So make no mistake, for any foreign fighter left in Iraq and Syria today, anyone left in Iraq and Syria fighting with ISIS today who came from outside, it's our mission to ensure that they die in Iraq and Syria. And for those who've already snuck out, it's our mission to ensure that they can be identified, tracked, and depending on the laws of our partner nations, detained and imprisoned. On counter-finance, the flow of outside money to ISIS has largely been severed. ISIS is now entirely a self-financing organization from within its dwindling holdings in Iraq and Syria. These holdings are shrinking, and we have been relentlessly targeting its oil and gas facilities, its networks, its smuggling networks, and its bulk cash storage sites. In terms of countering ISIS propaganda, as we just heard, this is now a 24/7 endeavor. Our coalition has established 24/7 counter-messaging hubs in UAE and the UK, and whereas ISIS once had free reign on Twitter, back in that summer of 2014 when we really looked at this, with pro-ISIS content back then outnumbered anti-ISIS content almost 6-1. We've worked with Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and that ratio is now totally reversed. It's 6-1 reversed. You're more likely to find anti-ISIS content than you are pro-ISIS content. An individual seeking ISIS propaganda, for example, is now likely to find narratives from ISIS defectors telling the real story of what the so-called caliphate was like, as they are to find messages from Baghdadi or other ISIS propagandists. So these trend lines are encouraging, but this war is not over, and President Trump has asked us to ensure not only that the trends continue, but accelerate. So let me talk a little bit about that. In February, the President tasked Secretary of Defense Mattis with a review of our campaign and charged all of us to find ways to accelerate it, to move faster, more effectively, more efficiently. In response, we reviewed the campaign design from top to bottom, the military and civilian dimensions. Secretary Mattis concluded that authority should be delegated from Washington to the lowest possible level in the field, thereby allowing us to seize opportunities real time as they develop. He also concluded that our tactics on the ground would focus on annihilating the enemy, ensuring that operations against ISIS result in no escape for ISIS fighters, while at the same time we have not changed at all, and this is sometimes misunderstood, we have not changed at all the very high standards for our airstrikes and civilian casualties. The battle has simply gotten more difficult over the coming months as we've moved into urban areas and ISIS is using hundreds of thousands of civilians literally as human shields. We also conducted and concluded in the course of this review that we can strengthen and better coordinate the non-military instruments of the campaign. That's both within our own interagency and across the global coalition. So the results of this review and accelerated campaign plan are now visible on the ground. In Raqqa, ISIS is now surrounded, and our partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces, are making steady progress towards the city center. The operation to seize Raqqa from ISIS began on June 6th, and it has proceeded now according to plan. In Mosul, ISIS is down to its last few kilometers. Iraqi forces 5 days ago launched decisive operations from 3 axes to clear the last district of the city, the most difficult old Mosul in the middle of Mosul. And that is ongoing, and we saw some of the results last night as they actually approached the Grand Mosque. ISIS leaders are being removed one by one through precision strikes and special operation raids, some of which we talk about and many of which we do not. Nearly all of Baghdadi's deputies are now dead, and he is sure to follow. Just 2 days ago, we confirmed the death of ISIS's so-called Grand Mufti, self-proclaimed Grand Mufti of ISIS, its spiritual advisor, a terrorist named Turki bin Ali, who is also right-hand man to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Turki bin Ali wrote pamphlets and crafted propaganda justifying the rape and enslavement of minority women and girls, and the mass murder of anyone he viewed as standing in the way of ISIS's perverted vision of Islam. He was killed by a coalition strike on May 31st in Mayadeen, Syria, a fate he and all ISIS terrorists justly deserve. As we succeed in defeating ISIS on the ground, our coalition, our global coalition against ISIS, is continuing to grow, adding Interpol, NATO, Djibouti, and Chad just in recent months, and with a concerted effort to focus on ISIS's fledgling attempts to organize on the African continent. Secretary of State Tillerson, in March, convened all coalition members in Washington to prepare for this accelerated campaign. He called on capitals to contribute stabilization and humanitarian resources to ensure that IEDs can be cleared from the streets, water and electricity restored, and conditions set for people to continue to return as we continue to clear ISIS out of territory it still controls. In that session alone, we raised over $2 billion for these initiatives, but much more will be needed from our coalition over the coming months. We've also been working diplomatically through our coalition to crack open doors that had been closed in this region. One manifest of which was Prime Minister Abadi's historic visit to Saudi Arabia earlier this week. And I happened to be in Jeddah the day before this breakthrough visit, meeting with now Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and we commend the initiative from both of these capitals to restore these important ties between Baghdad and Riyadh. So let me offer one example of how this accelerated campaign plan that we've put together works on the ground. In March, just a few months ago, I visited Syria. I go into Syria periodically with our team to assess what's happening. So I visited Syria in March with some of our military commanders to assess the military and civilian situation on the ground. We met with leaders from our partnered Syrian Democratic Forces, known as the SDF, at a town just north of Raqqa. This was before the Raqqa campaign had begun in earnest. These local leaders told us they sensed an opportunity. Just to our south, across Lake Assad, on the Euphrates River, lay the town of Tapka, the Tapka Airport, and the Tapka Dam. These are long-held strongholds of ISIS. SDF commanders believe that if the U.S. could provide helicopter transport across the lake, it's about an 8-kilometer jump across the water, with a force of local Arabs from the area, from Tapka, backed by Kurdish fighters, each site could be surrounded and seized within a month. thereby thoroughly enveloping and isolating Raqqa and enabling its more rapid seizure later this summer. They also asked for civilian support after the battle to help clear landmines and support the population of Tapka, nearly 90,000 people before the war, who had since been living under ISIS. The commander of our Combined Joint Task Force, Lieutenant General Steve Townsend, approved the operation. And within days of that meeting, it launched. Caught ISIS completely by surprise, and within 30 days, all 3 sites had been taken from ISIS, which was routed, hundreds of its fighters dead, and those watching from the sidelines in Raqqa, we know, were thoroughly demoralized. We've since worked to clear the Tapka Dam of explosives that had been left by ISIS, and our diplomats and civilian affairs teams on the ground are supporting the local council as it works to return the population to the city, now 15,000 returnees and counting. On my most recent visit to Syria just last month, I met this local council of Tapka. We helped mobilize some more coalition support to address a growing list of specific needs. An elderly man from Tapka approached me to explain what life was like under ISIS. And it's quite extraordinary to talk to these people who've been living under ISIS for a period of years. He said foreign fighters from as far away as Trinidad and Tobago came into his town to live there. They stalked his streets, and they murdered his friends and neighbors for not adhering to ISIS's arbitrary laws. And this gentleman is now on the local council helping to restore life to his hometown, and we're proud to work with him and so many Syrians and Iraqis like him. The speed of this operation in Tapka, surrounding the enemy, responding with civilian support, was due to authorities delegated from Washington to ground commanders and diplomats with ready access to coalition resources. And it set the stage for the seizure of Raqqa, which, as I noted, is underway and proceeding on plan. Tapka was in the news this week after Syrian regime forces launched an offensive towards a town controlled by the SDF, approximately 20 kilometers to the south. Whether on purpose or by mistake, this regime offensive crossed what both sides had understood to be an established line of separation between these forces. The escalation led to U.S. Air Forces destroying a Syrian Su-22 in the air to help defend our partner forces on the ground. As General Dunford said earlier this week, we are prepared to resolve situations like this through regular deconfliction channels to maintain maximum pressure on ISIS, which in this part of Syria lies to the east of where the regime forces are, not to their north, where they started moving. And while this situation remains dynamic, we've been encouraged by discussions over the last 96 hours or so among relevant parties to avoid further confrontations and establish a more stable deconfliction line. So this will be increasingly important, these kind of discussions, as ISIS degrades and multiple forces begin to converge in its wake. And in the meantime, we have shown that while we do not seek a conflict with anyone in Syria other than ISIS and al-Qaeda, which pose a threat to the United States, we will act whenever necessary to defend our forces and our partners on the ground fighting ISIS. Looking beyond ISIS in Syria, in cities like Raqqa and Tapka, as has been the case for every other coalition-supported operation to date, and we've been doing this now for 2 years, liberated 60,000 square kilometers, multiple cities, towns, and villages, we will help enable local actors to restore life in their cities. Coalition resources will help with the most basic stabilization needs, such as water and electricity, while the UN leads the humanitarian response. Just this past week, the World Food Program delivered food aid for 80,000 people and nutritional supplements for 5,000 children in areas north of Raqqa. And while our coalition is working with local Raqqawis from the Raqqa Civilian Council to identify stabilization projects in the city that will restore electricity, bakeries, and water, we will be prepared to help them restore those facilities as soon as the battle is over. Very similar to what we did in Mosul, although the situation in Syria is far more complex. The ultimate resolution of the Syrian civil war, the potential for return of state services to some of these areas which have been controlled by ISIS, is a political question that must be resolved politically, whether through the Geneva process led by Staffan de Mistura and or through direct talks between some of the parties on the ground. The Syrian regime, however, should not expect the global response that will be required to rebuild the areas now under its control, absent a credible political horizon that can result in a change in leadership and representative governance in Damascus. International support for Syria's post-ISIS future will be tied to this credible political horizon that can result in meaningful change. Beyond Iraq and Syria, our coalition is focused on ensuring ISIS affiliates remain local problems, able to be handled by local actors and partner nations before they can become transnational threats. In Libya, we've removed the ISIS safe haven in Sirte. We've destroyed its leadership network, and we're seeking to forge political ties between different factions in the country to deny space to extremists. In Egypt, we support President Sisi and the Egyptian government in its effort to combat terror networks in Sinai, just as we offer appropriate support to any partner nation where ISIS has sought to raise its black flag, from Bangladesh to the Philippines. And as ISIS loses its core territory in Iraq and Syria, we are also preparing for a shift in emphasis within our global coalition from military operations to intelligence and law enforcement operations. We are building a global network to share information in real time to detect ISIS operatives before they can act or travel across borders. And to do this, we encourage every member of our coalition to think differently about this problem. ISIS is a metastasized terror system, different from the al-Qaeda that we confronted after 9/11. It requires different tools and a willingness to share information in real time within governments and between governments. Our coalition, through one of its newest members, Interpol, is building the databases that will help protect all of us in the future. And we are establishing innovative information sharing and fusing centers designed to identify ISIS fighters and stop attacks. We're also asking a lot of our coalition partners to reform their own internal structures, to remove silos and share information from their national level to the local level and across borders to partners. Few do this better than Israel, and so I'll end where I began, thanking you again for this invitation and reminding everyone that Israel remains in the eye of the storm. Not long ago, I stood on the Golan Heights with Israeli defense forces overlooking southwest Syria, where an ISIS cell known as Jaish Khalid bin Walid is entrenched in a pocket of the tri-border region. And our coalition, working with the moderate opposition, must work to remove that presence as soon as possible, because ISIS, as it loses territory, recruits, and appeal, will seek to attack Israel. And we must do all we can, and we will do all we can, to ensure that we can defeat those designs. Nor can we allow Iran to jeopardize our gains and fuel instability in ISIS's wake by placing foreign proxies anywhere near the border regions with Jordan and Israel. Our coalition principle, and it has remained consistent throughout, is that local people, Syrians and Iraqis, local to their particular village, town, or city, should be in charge of their areas after ISIS is defeated, not foreigners. All foreign fighters should leave Syria, period, whether fighting with Nusra or ISIS or Hezbollah. Any other formula fuels the conflict, places innocent Syrians between crossfires on their own land, and encourages extremists and spoilers on all sides. So as we go forward, we call on all parties with influence in Syria to prioritize the fight against ISIS while de-escalating the civil war, whether through local agreements or defined de-escalation areas, and to set conditions for a political horizon and ultimate settlement. Let me close with an important caveat. This is among the most complex challenges in the most complex region of the world. Progress will not be linear. There will be setbacks. There will be adjustments. Not everyone will be happy with every decision that is made. That is certainly the case, and that is the nature of a coalition. But just as ISIS is dedicated to attacking us in our homes, our concert venues, our restaurants, even children in an ice cream parlor, as happened last month in Baghdad, we must be dedicated and committed to defeating them, and we are. Our coalition is on a fixed course with a sound and proven strategy, committed to the total destruction of ISIS, the destruction of the physical caliphate, while in parallel preparing for the day after. So friends and colleagues, I hope I've offered a brief window into this ongoing campaign, and the road ahead certainly remains daunting, but less so from the vantage point of how far we have come. So I want to thank you again for this opportunity, and General Gilad, it's been a rare honor, and I'll return the floor back to you. Thank you very much.